Hey, can you hear me?
Hey, what's up? Just so you know, I'm streaming.
Yeah. I was watching for a little bit.
Oh yeah, what's up?
Nothing much. Just hanging out. So I didn't know what necessarily you wanted to talk about. I know you're running ads right now.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Um,
And yeah, me neither. Not that I don't like. I'm so big, I hate your bubble. But I've had like 15 people have like emailed me over the past like couple weeks, like asking to chat about different topics. So, and I don't have our emails in front of us because I say we've added each other on
no, you're
Discord.
cool.
So
You're cool.
yeah, okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
hit me
You're
up.
fine, dude.
Introduce
I'm
yourself.
not worried.
What do you got? Who? Introduce yourself. Who are you? Let's start with that.
My name's Tristan. I run an account with a friend of mine that I've been running since I was about like an early teen called Atlas News
Hmm.
on Instagram.
Okay.
It covers conflict journalism primarily, but on the side we kind of do a little bit of politicking. The main, I guess, like sales pitch of the account is that both of us, me and the co-owner, when we were growing up, we had a lot of Fox News in the house. We had a lot of CNN in the house. We didn't really know which one was right or wrong. Our parents were always like, "Oh, watch a little bit of both, and you'll get somewhere in the middle. Like you'll find the truth on your own."
Hmm.
We were like, "Well, that sounds fucking stupid. Let's just write about it as objectively as possible."
Sure.
So we created this Instagram account, and now it has around 90K followers. So it's kind of its own thing, and
Okay.
we do it unpaid, completely just on our own.
Cool.
So yeah. So mainly we try and stay out of like the nitty gritty of like, oh, is Bernie Sanders going to win the presidency? It's more like um, 30,000 foot view than that. But
Okay. Um. Yeah. Well, cool. What I guess I guess the place I usually start is like, what have I been talking about lately that I guess inspired you to reach out to me?
I saw some of your like, well, I've watched a ton of your stuff.
Hmm.
Um, I'm generally a little bit more inclined to watch left-leaning content, and the other person that runs the account is a little bit more right. So we kind of balance each other out, which is really nice.
Sure.
Overall, your Bolivia coverage and the Hong Kong stuff that you did, I forget what the guy's name was, but he was the advisor for foreign policy on a
Oh,
senatorial campaign.
Dylan
Ah, shit.
Bruns or something. It was Dylan something, but yeah.
Yeah, he was really smart and
Hmm.
really cool, and I'm really glad that you platformed him, just
Hmm.
like to kind of talk about it as an expert.
Yeah.
I had a friend who runs Popular Front on Instagram and on podcasts.
Hmm.
That's his thing, his Jake Harahan, and he does a lot of different stuff when it comes to like nitty gritty conflict stuff. And he was in Hong Kong when you guys were actually talking about that, doing a documentary,
Oh, cool.
and like a lot of the stuff that he said was like nail right on the point. So
Okay. Awesome.
yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. This is the most people that I've ever talked in front of,
Oh,
so
don't worry. Most of them are
that
dumb as
works out.
fuck, so
But
you sound like a genius. Don't
I
worry.
mean,
I'm just fucking with you.
uh,
Don't worry.
if you well, hold on. If you run alternative news, I don't like to call it that, but
Hmm.
like non-mainstream media news, you get a lot of alt-right folks
Oh, yeah, of course.
and some fringe elements of the right and the left.
Hmm.
So it's a lot of
Crazy shit. Yeah, I
it's a lot of
understand.
that. Yeah, way crazier than your chat has ever been, in my opinion.
Okay, that's
Like
good.
they'll just be like, we'll just say like, oh, the Turkish did an airstrike on uh, um, Iblid, and it will just be like, the Jews did it.
Yeah. Yeah, or right
And it's
now
just like,
people
oh
like
god,
Zelensky are saying that like all of the Assad chemical weapons attacks were all false flags and stuff like that. Yeah.
oh my god, yeah. And then it's just so. I mean, you get it everywhere, but
Hmm.
totally.
So,
So, what would be like a kind of an international event that you have heard of that like we could maybe talk about?
Fuck, we haven't done internet. We talked about Soleimani quite a bit. I don't know if that's like worth talking
I
about at all.
mean, yeah. I mean, Soleimani was a really big thing.
Hmm.
I can just go over kind of like some stuff that we've covered just recently. Um, there has been, oh Jesus, there's a coronavirus, which is huge. I don't know if you talked about that on your channel. Um, Obviously, the big thing of like trying. Some people say that the Kurds are being encroached upon by the Turkish. Some people are saying that this will lead to ISIL coming back in the area. Some people say that ISIL is completely dead, like President Trump, and 100% defeated, like he said in the State of the Union.
Hmm.
There's a ton of different stuff going on in the Middle East. I mean, more notably, closer to us, like there was just a drug bust in I think it was hold on, Costa Rica.
Okay.
And that was huge. So like, oh, did you actually see this video? Hold on, I can actually
Uh-oh.
try and link you the story. Um, it was a drug cartel guy breaking out of prison with a bunch of guys. It literally looks like a video game. A bunch of guys dressed up as a bunch of cartel members dressed up as military and police,
Hmm.
and they had a shootout to get him out. And
Jesus.
that's I just linked it in Discord to you. But that was the coverage that we got in the surveillance footage.
This is
So
on
I
the
don't think you
Mexican
can show it
cartel
on
stuff?
stream. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know if you can show it on stream or not, but
Probably not, but yeah, I'll check it out after. One of the crazy things about the cartel in Mexico is that like we don't really think about this in the U.S., but like I'm pretty sure like the cartels in Mexico can like literally go toe to toe with the government if it comes to like having like shootouts and stuff. Yeah.
um, sorry, repeat that.
That like cartels like in Mexico are strong and well armed enough that like they can go like toe to toe with like police forces and like government forces if it comes to like
Oh my
shootouts and
God,
stuff.
totally. Everywhere in Latin America, there's a ton of different um, there's a, there's just a ton of different cartels and a lot of different crime influences, and the police a lot of time are bought in certain communities and stuff. Some
Hmm.
are better than others. A lot of northern Mexico is kind of run a little bit more hands-on by the cartel, more stuff towards Mexico City and stuff like that. It gets a little bit more
Sure.
of the
Oh, sorry.
government's.
And yeah, I'm sorry. I mean the like the local police forces or whatever, not necessarily like the Mexican military. My bad. Sorry, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, well, they're kind of one and the same. A lot of Latin American countries, they don't have a dedicated police force like we do in here in the United States. A lot of it's actually military run.
Hmm.
That's why you have like Maduro in Venezuela. Like a lot of his police, quote unquote, are a bunch of guys in like military fatigues and just a bunch of different um, kids with like automatic assault rifles and things like that, where they just give them a gun and give them a stable source of food, and then they support Nicolas Maduro.
Oh, nice.
So it's kind of this weird thing.
Wait, so
And
how do you
oh, go
feel
ahead.
about Maduro? You're supposed to be the left-leaning guy, right?
Yeah, that's a most honest framing that you could have given me. No, with Maduro, it's a little bit of a weird context to it.
Hmm.
You had said before that you know, what did you say? You said something along the lines of that it's not that they want Maduro, but they
They
don't
don't want the
necessarily want the
U.S. to
United
do something.
States.
Yeah, they just
Yeah,
don't. Yeah, but that, generally.
because of just all the stuff that we used to do in like the 90s and the 80s
Hmm.
with funding, the different rebels and everything like that.
Sure.
So that's kind of like a touchy subject. I don't necessarily support or not support anybody. It's not necessarily my country, so I don't
Hmm.
think that I really get a say in their foreign policy, and I like to be as objective as possible.
Hmm.
But from a lot of my Venezuelan friends who, for all transparency, are kind of like not in the country anymore for
Hmm.
the most part. And the ones that are like in Caracas, and I've seen them give me just videos. I have them on my Instagram that they took of like people just getting shot in protests,
Hmm.
and they were just like right there, very close to all the action going on. It seems like a lot of people, especially in the inner cities and stuff, are the support for Maduro is waning just because of when a lot of people have said it best of when people are full and happy, there's no problems, but there's constant power outages, constant water outages, there's constant lack of food. So with
Hmm.
all those problems coming in, they're going to blame the administration, whether it's their fault or not. Maduro is most certainly at some sort of fault,
Hmm.
but to what I can't necessarily say because a lot of it's shrouded in misinformation.
Sure. One of the things that one of the things that I've read before that's kind of scary when you have like a type of government where the government provides so many services is that like one of the things that Maduro can do is he can like crank the fuck up out of like certain social programs like around election season and shit, and that this is one of the ways that he kind of holds on to power because as long as things are going okay, people are generally happy with things.
Yeah, and that's the problem with countries with weak political institutions, right?
Hmm.
Because you get a lot of these things that we always joke about, like precedent here in the United States and stuff like that. But it is a genuinely very important conversation to have of like these social programs when they go into place. What power are you giving the federal government? And do we have strong enough institutions where that power won't then be abused just for political,
Yeah.
scoring points? Uh, I think that in the United States, a little bit of a comparable thing to a less extreme degree is tax breaks. You know,
Sure. One
when
thing
your
that
small business is
scares
doing. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say one thing that scares me that's kind of related to this recently is like my understanding is that there's supposed to be like a pretty decent separation between the DOJ and the president. Like the DOJ doesn't serve at like the behest of the president. Like I think the president like nominates like the attorney general and shit, but for the most part the DOJ is its own separate entity. But it seems like Trump,
Supposed to be, yeah.
yeah, but it seems like Trump doesn't really care about that right now, which is kind of scary.
Um, well, the interesting thing about that, in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
is that Trump doesn't really have a leg to stand on when he says, like, oh, well, the DOJ is supposed to go do everything on my behest.
Mm-hmm.
The president can direct where, like, federal investigations and FBI stuff kind of goes, but he shouldn't have, like, a firm hand on what they kind of do and what they say. Like you said, separation of powers, because the DOJ in itself is supposed to be kind of a check on.
Wait, Can you expand?
Go
And
ahead.
then if any of this gets too particular, you can tell me. My understanding is that that's not true. That the president isn't supposed to be able to say like, "Hey, DOJ, you guys go and investigate that." I thought that that's like the DOJ is supposed to stand on its own to do that. The president is supposed to direct them around.
Sure, sure. For instance, it's not necessarily that he's like, oh, you should do this right now. It's
Mm-hmm.
more of, for instance, what they were talking about. I think Biden said it pretty well in the presidential or primary debate that just happened. He said that they directed certain monitors to go to the stop and frisk
Mm-hmm.
policy that Mayor Bloomberg has. That's absolutely true.
Sure.
Like you can go
Okay.
in and you can put certain monitors and kind of say like where the DOJ like basically make a suggestion, but you shouldn't be like what President Trump doing with the oh God, U.S. politics is not necessarily my forte, just because I'm more internationally
Okay.
focused. But more to the point of like, he kind of like directs them in a way that's a little bit too hands-on,
Sure.
if that's a very simplistic way of putting it.
Sure.
And I think that that's kind of the argument. And when it's the guy that you don't like,
Mm-hmm.
it's always going to be, oh yeah, this is wrong. And when it is the guy that you do like, it's like, oh yeah, this is fine.
Sure. What do you think? What do you think is going to happen with the Uyghur China stuff? Do you think anything is
Oh
going to
my
happen, or
goodness.
do you think no? Like I feel like no one's going to really give a fuck, or no one currently
I
does.
don't think anybody's really going to care. If
Yeah.
people cared about the Uyghurs, I mean, we would stop. I mean, like we hear this all the time from both parties. It's like, oh yeah, China's doing so many bad things. They're having so many humanitarian violations. And I just remember all the time you go into any classroom or any humanitarian um, place, and when you bring up these issues, they're so prevalent and they're so talked about
Yes,
and
Nathan
understood. Like the
W.
Uyghurs need help. Hong Kong needs some sort of liberation. The people in Kashmir are being oppressed by Pakistani and Indian different government forces there. All these minority groups. I mean, for instance, I'm on the spot, so I'm like forgetting their name. It's the largest stateless people in the world. The Rohingya. Sorry.
Okay.
The Rohingyas peoples. They get their limelight in the media, but a lot of time it's just not covered enough. People don't care enough, and I think Pete actually did say this pretty good in the debate. The idea that Americans think that they can have like a strong presence when it comes to directing Chinese foreign policy or internal government affairs
Mm-hmm.
is just laughable. We just don't have that much control, and I don't think that any amount of, you know, stomping or getting mad at the situation is actually going to help these people. I think that all you can do is really try and donate to humanitarian funds and the people on the ground that are going to end up helping these people, and hope that internal change does happen. And I think where you can kind of pressure those things that is appropriate, you should do that. But the fact that the next president is going to come up there and be like, President Xi, you gotta stop harassing all the Uyghurs and try and culturally convert them and make them renounce Islam.
Well,
I
it
just
seems
think
like,
it's
I mean, this is literally a genocide, right? Like, this is what the
oh
definition.
totally,
Yeah.
absolutely,
So, like, I don't know. I guess the
or
thing
at
that
least in
bothers me is that, like, people always talk about, like, oh, well, you know, if I would have been alive during Nazi Germany, we would have invaded immediately. America wouldn't have sat out World War II. We would have gone in right away if we knew that was happening.
yeah.
And then it's like, well, it's happening now, and no one wants to do anything.
I mean, yeah, you get like I've heard you talk to, and I don't like to talk about this. This is like a alt-right talking point,
Mhm.
but and I've heard you and Hassan
Oh, God, you're not about
literally
to
go
blame the
on and
Jews,
on.
are you?
No, no, not at all,
Okay.
not at all. No, the Jews had nothing to do with this, please, and that's not sarcasm.
Okay.
Uh, Basically, I hear you talk about this with Hassan too. It's like, oh, what's the death toll for capitalism versus communism?
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's like when Joseph Stalin was starving like all the Ukrainians
Hmm.
by accident and also on purpose. Like the United States didn't invade,
Hmm.
right? So it's like that's not necessarily, I don't think, going to happen. And I think that's just like a bunch of hot air of
Sure.
people just saying, "Oh yeah, like if not the Nazis were around nowadays, I'd go in there and clobber them." But then like when you punch Richard Spencer in the face, everybody's like, "Oh God, not force.
Yeah.
You can't hurt people. Why would you do that? This is America."
Hmm.
So
Um, so the hot button issues right now, we don't care about Hong Kong anymore because that's out of the news cycle. How do you think the Hong Kong issue gets resolved? What's going to happen with that?
um, what do I think is going to happen with Hong Kong?
Yeah, like what is the end game
Um,
for that? Like, what do you remember when the resolution when do they reintegrate into China proper?
oh,
Isn't
I
it
think
like
it
2050 or
was.
something, or is it earlier than that?
I don't want to say anything off the top of my head that's incorrect. So let me see. Hong
Hmm.
Kong reintegration. Integration. It was slated. It happened on July 1997. Is when like the degree happened. The decree, sorry,
Hmm.
happened. And then I think it was supposed to be like somewhere around 2010, but I'm not 100% certain. 2012?
Oh,
Let me change this up.
2047 for Hong Kong, 2049 for Macau. Macau.
Yes, 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 yes.
Okay.
And Macau has been expedited way, like that's also another thing because like they're not necessarily like an English speaking area in Macau.
Hmm.
It was more Portuguese influence. Like a lot of people, the way that China kind of went around kind of getting rid of their autonomy happened a lot quicker than Hong Kong, but they just didn't make as much of a buzz about it.
Gotcha.
So I don't know what the end game for Hong Kong is going to be. I think they're stuck with China. I don't think that the United States is going to invade China on the behalf of Hong Kong. I just think that's
Hmm.
anybody who says that is just a grifter and silly and just wants to talk about, uh, chest beating United States military industrial complex and say that, oh yeah, we could kick China's ass. That's a thing that I always hear is like, oh yeah, the United States could basically take on Iran. If we went to war with Iran, we could take on China if we went to war with China. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Sure.
Obviously, I think you know that too.
Yeah, of course.
So I don't think that the United States interests, that would, if at the very least, that would be the most unpopular economy ending war in U.S. history.
Yeah,
So,
or world economy, really, even. Yeah.
oh, totally. Mhm. I mean, like, just if we think, the coronavirus is impacting Apple stock right now,
Hmm.
what do you think is going to happen if the United States goes to war? Um, but I think that it's a lot of chest beating by both the left and the right. I think you get a lot of people. Generally, you get political points for basically saying,
Fuck
you
China.
know, yeah, fuck China and denouncing them.
Hmm.
And while I think that it's important to kind of state where your your values are as a country, I don't think that actually interacting fundamental change is going to happen unless it comes from internally through China. And I think that that's the main thing that I think is good about Hong Kong is that a lot of these people, if they are serious about politics, could go in to um, the political complex and make some sort of effective change through that, because the way that I see it, it's eventually going to become another city in China, if not one that has a few more people that are democratically inclined,
Hmm.
you know. I still think it's important to highlight it and really um, to cover it and make sure that those people are having a voice because, best case scenario, they get a lot of Western influences, and then those people end up kind of getting a lot of following and funding and everything that way, and they kind of create their own political campaigns within China. But just based off of just how closed off the Chinese people kind of are from Western media and iOSs and stuff like that, because they have Huawei
Yeah.
and so many different like WeChat and things like that.
Hmm.
They have like so many different areas of communication that us Westerners just don't use.
Yeah.
I think that that's the more important thing to highlight, is just that Hong Kong's a little bit of an anomaly because they have so much of our telecommunication infrastructure,
Hmm.
and China just overall doesn't.
Sure. Are there any foreign policy takes that I give that you totally disagree with? Is there stuff that I've said that you think I'm like I missed the mark
Mm,
on or something, or you disagree?
I don't think that there's anything that I've outright disagreed with. I think that the Bolivia coverage is hard to nail down correctly.
Hmm.
And I think that overall, I didn't think that any of your takes were absurdly like, oh, off base or anything like that. But I think that David Pakman had like a few hot takes that was a little weird. But so did Kyle Klinsky. Like, that guy's, whew. Um,
Yeah.
so you just kind of get a lot of these people who are democratic socialists essentially like looking for their Venezuela that works.
Yeah.
And I think that that's conveniently what Bolivia is, and people are just less informed on it because it's a smaller country and it's farther from us, and there's less U.S. interest in it.
Do you think
And
Bolivia?
it's
Would you say that Bolivia was a coup? Do you agree with that, or?
Um, I think it was definitely a power grab. I don't know if
Hmm.
I'd necessarily call it a coup, just because I don't think that any of the numbers are there. But like definitionally, I think you could successfully call it a coup.
Gotcha.
Like it was definitely like contested election information,
Hmm.
and then you had the military back essentially the person in charge. So I think it's a little bit similar to the Maduro situation, where a lot of these elections, and a professor of mine back at college told me he was kind of an expert, and he did his main study on I shouldn't say third world countries, but developing nations elections, and how corruption kind of plays into it, and how a lot of the times is actually a source of income for these families, is that like their vote means so little to them in the established institutions that they would rather get some money on the side. And I think his main area of study was Thailand,
Hmm.
but he ended up kind of bringing it to Latin America I think it was, he did a study on Peru and Argentina. So very similar countries, not quite as impoverished as Venezuela and Bolivia, but similar calibers. Um, and it's like you get a lot of people who just don't even show up, or if they do, they sell their vote out to other people, sign a bunch of papers, like sign a bunch of ballots before the election comes around, and then they're just used by somebody else in their name,
Damn.
essentially as like absentee ballots. And so even if like there's like 97% like favorability or re-election rating for like Maduro, and
Hmm.
he wins with like 97% of the vote, a lot of the time that actually ends up coming from votes that they paid for. A lot of Democratic uh, coalitions like protesting that person, like
Hmm.
in Maduro's case. Um, and I think that that's a similar case in Bolivia, where this time you had a bunch of people essentially coming out and going against the status quo, but I can't necessarily say how many of those votes were legitimate or not. I think
Sure.
that's the tricky kind of nuanced take that not many people like. People like looking at the numbers and shouting, "Oh, this means that that person definitely won." And I don't think that you can necessarily say that with the same stability that you can with the United States,
Hmm.
because like everybody always screams about voter fraud here, but it happens like one
Very,
like
very, very rarely.
one in every 9 million votes, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I think that the main thing to take away from those countries is a lot of time just weak political institutions, and they don't have as much. Um, they don't have as much presence in average people's lives. Like we like to say that like democracy is like amazing and every country should have it, and I agree on the whole. But you have to also make it meaningful for people to want to vote, and I think that that's one of the main things that people forget is that in a lot of these countries, who's sitting in like there are a lot of places in Venezuela right now that are operating perfectly. I have a friend in Aruba who was just talking about they have like a way harsher amount of Venezuelan refugees coming in, but
Mm-hmm.
he has a bunch of family in Venezuela that's living in kind of like more rural or third, fourth, fifth largest city or something like that, and those places are completely untouched. Like they're just it's business as usual. A lot of times it's the capital and the places surrounding the capital that are very, very hot button for a lot of these places, or places that had escalating situations like famine or drought, and they needed those government subsidies to kind of give them the extra leg up to live.
Sure. Okay. What are some like foreign events right now that you think are going to be like hot button topics soon, or is there something brewing right now that you think is like a big deal that people aren't talking about enough yet, or?
I mean, people never really talk about Africa. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you have a bunch of things going on in you have just a bunch of stuff happening in Somalia with the civil war. You have oh my God, this is so unprofessional of me, but I'm forgetting the main terrorist group in Africa.
Mm-hmm. I don't know at all. So I don't know fuck all about Africa. So.
Yeah, and exactly, it's just like there's uh, um, I'm just completely Boko Haram.
Al
Sorry.
Shabaab, Boko
Can we
Haram.
get
Okay.
league? Thanks
Yeah, yeah.
anyone that Reese's a
And Boko
commie
Haram is
instant
like,
ban thanks.
I think it's probably
Can we get some
it's
Africa
one of
by Toto
the
thanks?
places affiliated with like ISIL and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
and like they're like terrorist organizations generally don't work well with each other. They're extremists, so they just want power and different influences in regions. But they were working pretty hand in hand in certain situations, and um, it's one of those things where people don't look at it until it's
An international crisis or something.
or it's convenient, I mean, like you can read, I guarantee you could look up like the death toll in Africa from terrorist organizations and it would be comparable at least to the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's these countries that had that were not as politically expedient to kind of look at and not as opportunistic for people to kind of make into a talking point, those didn't pop up because they're a lot more nuanced. Like I did a huge report on and looked into a lot of the very systemic issues in the Central African Republic, which is still one of the worst countries to live in today. South Sudan is again another one of those countries where if you just live in there, I would legitimately rather be a witch in the Irish witch trials than be living in like South Sudan or Central African Republic today. It's like the whole entire eastern half of the country is just basically owned by warlords who used to be on each other's sides, and now that the UN kind of stepped in and put French troops in the center of the country, they've basically just been paid with land and money to fuck off. And then it's literally that meme where it's like, I'm going to pay you $100 to fuck off.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just leave the western half of the country alone. And now they're just infighting with each other with child soldiers and all sorts of different stuff. And, that's kind of like similar to what the whole Coney 2012 thing
20, yeah.
2020, yeah.
Nothing. Sorry.
It's coming back. No, like Coney 2012 was this entire like talk about Coney, who was said to be in Uganda, then he was said to be in the Central African Republic, then he was said to be in all these different places. Nobody knew, nobody gave a fuck. They just like wanted to make it a Christian talking point. So and that's the truth of it, is that these people don't necessarily care. It's more of like what fits their narrative.
True.
I saw you almost die there. So do you want to keep on international politics? One of the main things that I think will be like a really big hot button issue in the future, I think it's going to probably be Saudi Arabia. Um, when MBS kind of steps formally into power, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the populace, because right
What
now,
is MBS again? Can you clarify?
isn't it their prince?
Oh, okay.
Uh, MBS is just the acronym for his name.
Gotcha.
It's Mohammed bin Salman
Okay,
Al
gotcha.
Al Saud, which is the House of Saudi Arabia.
Hmm.
Right now, his dad, Solomon of Saudi Arabia, he's the um, he's the no, that's the prime minister. He's the crown prince. I forget what his dad's name is, but
Yeah, it's fine, it's fine. But
he's
what is
getting up there.
yeah? What's the problem with Saudi Arabia, or what's the worry?
He's just a modernizer. Like he very much pushed for the women to be
The
able to
women driving
drive
thing, yeah.
and get their licenses. He's very big in like the tech sphere. He had the one meeting in Saudi Arabia that was heavily um, like a lot of tech companies essentially said like we're not going to go because of the whole Jamal Khashoggi situation, which is just it just goes to show that like he's seen as this modernizer, but he goes and just like cuts people up and leaves them in like Constantinople's backyard
Hmm.
or Istanbul, however you want to say it. Well, Istanbul's the correct
Hmm.
way, but in general, like you have these brutal dictators who kind of make this payoff with their people of like, we'll give you financial security and, security in the way of like job growth and economic stability. But that means human rights have to go out the window. Qatar, the UAE, all these countries that are very heavily funded on oil. I think that if climate change does end up being like kind of the world stopping issue that a lot of climate scientists theorize that it will be, um, I think that you're going to see a lot of change when it comes to the energy sector. And I think that a lot of these countries are going to end up kind of being in the same situation that Hong Kong's in right now, where, if you take away the economic stability, or rather like what Venezuela's in right now, if you take away that economic stability and that, like, you don't feed those empty bellies, a lot of people end up being a lot more um, susceptible to protest. And I mean, you see it all over Lebanon and stuff like that too right
Hmm.
now. It's just economic struggle goes hand in hand with political struggle. And that's one thing that the socialists do get right half the time, is like just when you have a bunch of people that
That aren't
are
eating or.
hungry. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And your government is not popular all of a sudden, then people want those rights that have not been afforded to them, that they were kind of knowing that you were holding out on, but they were okay with it because of the security.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that in the next like 10 years is really going to be a conversation that's going to have to pop up in Saudi Arabia. I think it already has a little bit, but I think that in Iran, it's a little bit more nuanced. Every single time that the Trump administration or anybody else denounces Iran and says they hate them more, they just empower more of the same extremely conservative, powerful people in Iranian politics that end up being the same people that end up fighting them, like Soleimani and stuff like that.
Sure.
Um, I mean, when when the um, when the Iran deal went through with President Obama, that was actually like a huge boon to like the moderates. And I'm not saying like it was a good deal, or I'm not saying either way, whatever you want to say, but this is just like the reality, the political reality of a lot of these decisions is that when you work with countries like this, you empower people who say, "Oh, you see, we can work with the United States,"
Hmm.
because that's proof in their eyes that that's the political reality that they see. But if you consistently just lambast them and say that, oh, they're breaking all the rules and this is the worst trade deal in the history of man,
Yeah.
then you end up empowering a lot of the conservatives that say, see, we have to fight the United States with asymmetrical warfare at every
Hmm.
single turn and opportunity.
Especially when we jerked around Iran so much recently. The Bush axis
Oh,
of evil
totally.
shit was another like really bad blowout, like our relations with Iran. Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, the axis of evil is where it all started, right?
Hmm.
Saudi Arabia, Iran, and
Well, I mean, arguably our history with Iran was before that, right?
oh
Um,
yeah, I mean, it started with the Persian Empire, the prince or the king who the Shah who had to I think he
yeah,
still
over
lives in
the
the United States.
the British protecting the British fucking petroleum company
Yeah.
like
Mhm.
nationalizing their fucking oil fields and shit. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also another situation where a lot of the conservative individuals who kind of went off of the country's pro-Islam stance heavily capitalized on that for political power. And then you have things like the Revolutionary Guard, which is essentially like the most conservative institution that you can pretty much have in any Islamic country. It's just a secret police that is fueled by the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, and when you have a country that, if we had a secret Christian police in the United States that was fueled off of the Bible, and you'd they could do unspeakable things with a book that's supposed to be about like peace.
Yeah.
Like with any sort of text that goes back 100 years like that, if you empower people that use that to kind of justify their actions, it's going to be horrible.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, that's one of the main things. I don't necessarily have any problems with your takes. I do have a question for you that's a little bit off topic. So do you want to do that real
Yeah,
quick?
sure. Hit me up. What do you got?
So you talked a lot about kind of disowning like a lot of the commies and the people on the left that are really like far left. Um, for years, we've been doing Atlas News, and there's most of the people that follow us are pretty middle of the road, just kind of like people who consume news. But if you go into our comments section, you'll find a few hundred people at least
Mm-hmm.
that are just spewing nonsense. And I think that there's a real question that has to be had along a lot of communities, especially since like you're just even you platforming me or you platforming a lot of the people. I think you talked about this in one of your other streams, just the fact that you platformed like a lot of the people that now you're just kind of like pissed off are on your platform. Even I don't think that you feel that way about Hassan, but even like a bunch of the lefties that are
Mm-hmm.
now kind of like all over the place on Twitch and stuff and
Sure.
political commentary and stuff. I think that there's going to be a real problem in social media and stuff like that, and maybe it's already here, but of what audiences deserve to be consuming the content. And I would make the argument that like almost everybody deserves to be well informed, but there comes to be a point where like where do you censor people, where do you not, and where do you kind of, because you have like I think a really good position where you can kind of disavow those people, and since you're more of a commentary channel on the whole, that's not out of brand for you. But like where do people like formal mainstream media or alternative media resources that are supposed to be like professional reporting, when did those people kind of denounce the following that they've gotten?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how much can even be done at this point about it. Like, it feels like it's kind of like the new thing online. Like, I don't know how old are you?
I'm a 21.
I don't know how long you've been involved in this, but like maybe like 5 years ago, like kind of the trendy thing was like the whole anti-SJW Gamergate, like that culture, the skeptic culture was like very popular on YouTube.
Oh my god, yeah.
Yeah.
That's I was red pilled easily
Yeah.
by that.
Yeah, now it
Like
kind
you
of
talk
feels
about you
like
being a libertarian, that was me,
yeah.
5 years ago.
Yeah,
Easily.
yeah. And now it kind of feels like, well, now it's the age of like the new counterculture is going to be like the lefties online. That's going to be like the new thing. So hopefully it comes and it goes after a few years and it's just the new popular thing. The hip thing is to be like a socialist now or whatever. So,
Yeah. Because like I don't believe in like censoring people. I think that that's kind of like, especially like in my case, censoring them from actually like just consuming media in general,
mm-hmm.
like consuming reporting and everything like that. I think that that's really a stupid and hard thing to kind of um, judge. But I do think that it's interesting just kind of purging your own communities as well and disavowing things. I wonder if that's going to play more of a role as these kind of like extremist uh, fringe groups of different um, social media platforms and everything. I wonder if that's going to be the case or not.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what'll happen in the future. Who knows?
But yeah. As for anything else, I think that the main things that you should look at right now is actually like the Uyghurs is a huge thing, because that is, like you said, essentially like a cultural ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, basically.
Um,
Well, that's exactly what they're trying to do, right? Is destroy the people.
yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced than that too, because I think it's more or less more of like a attempted cultural conversion, and when that when people aren't like, oh yeah, let's just deny all of our cultural roots and just go with like whatever the Han Chinese cultural kind of identity is. When they don't agree to that, it's like, oh yeah, well then we'll just get rid of you in concentration camps,
Yeah,
essentially.
basically, which is like that's like a genocide, right? Is you're trying to, I think,
Yeah,
like the international definition is like trying to erase or enacting some policies with the goal of erasing like a group of people's culture or nationality or identity,
yeah.
religious or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah, so I definitely think that like you're perfectly able to call it a genocide and it be completely accurate. But I think that a lot of the time when people think genocide, they obviously immediately think Nazi Germany, and
sure.
where that was like an extermination of a people group, I think that this is more an extermination of a cultural identity, and whether that be you willingly renounce it and kind of conform,
Mm-hmm.
or you struggle against it, the result is going to be the same. You are effectively eliminated from society,
Sure.
whether that be just from you converting to something else or you becoming dead,
Yeah.
essentially. And you can see it with like the shipment of people. China has no really limit on its or not limit, I shouldn't say that. It doesn't really have a problem with population. So they can move people around with the government sanctioned programs. And that's what they've done to the Uyghurs is they've brought, and the Tibet people as well, as they brought a bunch of Han Chinese like workers in with a kind of like carrot and stick,
Mm-hmm.
moving them around with like money and job influences and the ghost cities that you see all the time that
Yeah.
are like built for people to move into that nobody really ends up moving into.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to force people in with incentives and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, when you do stuff like that, and China is kind of like a unique case that we don't really understand in the United States, when stuff like that happens, it's like you can literally just influx one group of people, and then that group of people are the only people that matter in that area. And I
Yeah.
think that that's what's happening to the Uyghurs on the whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Damn.
So,
Um. Well, fuck. Do you have anything else you want to talk about or anything you want to chat about?
not necessarily. I just wanted to say that like I pretty much enjoy your content a lot, and I think that if you did more international stuff, it would be really cool.
Yeah.
I'm not the best like speaker, so I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that I've done a crazy good job here of interesting people.
No, it's
But
okay. Foreign policy
I
is
did want
really
to.
hard because it's so far away. Like most people, like just generally, even during election cycles, just don't really care about foreign policy unless it's like a
Yeah,
hot
and
take news item.
that's yeah, you've said that a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
like while I want to disagree, you're right. So I can't. It's like it's one of those things where people don't care about it until it's right at your doorstep.
Yeah.
And I would say that the thing that does matter about it, and I think that this is important for kind of the left people to know as well, is the right focuses on it as a straw man for any argument that they have about, terrorism or anything like that. But there are people, and it's like a lot of human suffering happens, and you need to pay attention to it because at the end of the day, this is literally and if you're this is going to sound like such a libertarian move, but if you're at all worried about like government tyranny or anything, these countries are like case studies on how that stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the humanitarian stuff that's being done on the ground is really important stuff to recognize for any country in the future, because if things do end up with shit hitting the fan, you need people kind of who are engrossed in like foreign policy and things like that to understand, okay, we've been here before, so how do we stop it from progressing like it did in Syria or like it did in any of these countries of origin, like South Sudan or anything like that. Because a lot of people, on the whole, will be like, oh, this is a good thing, so let's just
Why?
not
So
necessarily.
here's a question: why do you think
Sure.
we've been so unable to learn from past foreign policy mistakes? So, for example, with countries like Afghanistan, like not having a clear mission, not having a clear vision, not having like an actual goal, like why? Like we've had so many cases where we've successfully dealt with it, like in Bosnia, and then we've had cases where we've unsuccessfully dealt with it, like Vietnam. Like, why is it so hard to like get a coherent foreign policy strategy on things like Afghanistan?
So I think there's pretty much two schools of thought for this kind of talk. Is you can basically say that it's because of the changing regimes, but I would say one of the big things, like like Obama has some sort of policy that's pretty consistent with George Bush's policy,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's because the lower level people and a lot of the people at the bottom, like the generals or the ambassadors or the diplomats and stuff like that, they are career politicians a lot of time, or they're career public servants, I should say.
Mhm.
And a lot of those people end up kind of coming around and essentially exerting their will or what they think is right, regardless of uh, what the administration thinks. And the direction that they have to go is essentially, do you, from the bottom up, change a lot of the people in um, positions of any influence whatsoever? Do you change kind of what those people are uh, geared towards doing, and you change kind of the policies that they're supposed to be enacting? Or do you kind of go as business as usual and end up with a lot of these mistakes that end up happening, but overall maybe you're doing it a little bit better? And I think that the problem with, like, for instance, right now that you have in Afghanistan is a lot of the people that are involved now have learned from the mistakes I think Afghanistan is actually a pretty good example of like learning from United States' mistakes in recent kind of translation, because like right now, unfortunately, like we have to be working with like the Taliban and stuff like that. And I'm not like endorsing that or saying that that's a good decision, but at the end of the day, a lot of these things that we were trying to fight against just end up popping up again later on.
Mhm.
And I think that that comes from a lot of generals and a lot of military individuals basically coming in and saying like, well, this bombing the shit out of them didn't work, and trying to put troop deployments in among like civilians didn't work at all.
Mhm.
So, are we supposed to be working with the locals? Oh, and when we do work with the locals, does that mean that we just end up kind of perpetuating a lot of the violence that we wanted to stop, or or endangering people's lives like we did with a lot of translators that worked with us?
Mhm.
Or do we kind of have a more nuanced approach and work with people that won't endanger them and further U.S. interests and stuff like that? And I think that that's a really hard line to tread, and I don't think that a lot of people get as much credit as they deserve.
Yeah.
But the main thing is that a lot of people end up moving in and they have these like huge ideas about how to change like the country and how to have like a new strategy, and those people just end up learning the same lessons the hardest way that the people former to them learned. And again, it's the simplicity of a president saying we're going to go to war with these people, and then it's like, well, how are we actually going to figure this out?
Hmm.
you
Okay.
know so this isn't like a hot take. I don't think that any of these are necessarily hot takes. They're pretty like low level common sense type stuff, but I just think it's the incapable or the
Incapability.
no, I think it's like more of the unwillingness of the United States to look at its foreign policy failures and correct them. I mean, you can even go back to like we're funding different terrorist organizations prior to 9/11 and stuff like that. I don't think that these countries or these organizations on the whole should be played with like they're good government actors that are going to take our money and do the right thing and never harm us again. I
Mhm.
think that that's a huge mistake that we're just starting to learn. But I think that the problem then is also like, well, who do you support? And for instance, like I'm a little bit biased here. We have a lot of people who have supported the account for a very long time who are like Peshmerga fighters and stuff like that.
Mhm.
You can find all these Instagram accounts of like Peshmerga guys who have been fighting for the Kurds forever. Do you know what the Peshmerga are?
The Peshmerga are the military division of the Kurdish people that live in northwest Iraq and Kurdistan, right? The
Yeah, yeah,
Kurdistan,
yeah.
yeah, autonomous region. Yeah.
Precisely, exactly. And a lot of those guys, like some people we've known, have been like killed and stuff like that
Mhm.
in combat. And a lot of those guys have a really, really nuanced opinion on foreign policy because they are there on the ground, like fighting.
Yeah,
And
those
I
are the
think
guys
that
that were like played a huge part in retaking oh my god, the Iraqi city that Baghdadi was
um,
in. The big assault on
ch-
on
isn't it
on Mosul. Yeah.
Mosul?
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. They
Mosul?
they played a
Yeah.
big part in a lot of that fighting and a lot of the
Yeah,
returning
I
of the
was like,
territory.
I was like, big Iraqi city.
Yeah. So yeah.
No, you're good. And and that's like a really big issue is that a lot of those guys ended up taking over the city, and that's another area where like there's a lot of autonomy, and the United States only helped them when it was economically or not economically
Politically
politically
feasible.
advisable.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, politically feasible. It was the only time that they were just really like, oh yeah, the Kurds, they're our best friends. We should support them as much as physically possible. And then the minute that it becomes, an issue with Turkey, and the enemies that they were fighting are kind of no longer in the picture, suddenly it's not really a good idea. And I think that that's a big thing, is you have these like pretty politically stable. I mean, like there's this really awesome journalist. His name is Robert Evans,
Mm-hmm.
and he's really great. He's done a lot of work in Syria and stuff like that. And over the years, like he got to see like a lot of like Rojava and these cities that are kind of like this weird like collectivist like government structure,
You
and it's
should
like
ask
something
him about
new
the
that like
Algerian
has been
Revolution in
uplifting a lot
Libya.
of people
It's the biggest thing not talked
overall,
about in the
and making them
mainstream
a little
media.
bit like a lot of women have been uplifted from the Islamic extremist kind of role of just being like a housekeeper and essentially like a caregiver. A lot of those people have been like, they give them like farm stipends, and they allow them to go live on these kind of like collectivized farming estates essentially. And a lot of those, and they teach them a lot of like real life skills of how to, care for yourself, how to grow food, how to care for the community. And I think that that's a really powerful and great thing that a lot of people don't end up actually looking at, because it's just not a popular thing.
Sure.
And it's not an exciting, like eye-grabbing story. So a lot of these people end up getting left in the dirt when there's a new policy decision to be made, because it's not politically popular or exciting to really support those people.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I'm again not the best public speaker,
No,
but
it's okay.
trying to hit my points home a little bit.
Yeah, no problem. Okay.
Yeah, I think that generally you and I are pretty much in agreement with a lot of the stuff that ends up happening foreign policy wise. And I think that the big thing is that it has to support U.S. interests, but I think that another thing is it has to support stability in a region, and stability in the region has never really been achieved through like neo-imperialism means of just like putting a military in there and telling them to go ham.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, if I ever give like a foreign policy take that you disagree with, or if there's if there's ever anything that comes up that you feel is like really good to chat about that I'm not like talking about, yeah, you can always feel free to shoot me a message or whatever, and then yeah, we can go there.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know that you got other people to talk to and other things to do.
Yeah, no problem.
So yeah, no, it's really awesome speaking to you. Hopefully we can do it again at some point, and I'll be a little bit more exciting, and maybe we can plan it out a little bit if there's some sort of like foreign policy thing, like very big thing that happens. Maybe we can talk about it. But yeah, it was awesome talking to you.
All right, cool. Well, hey, I appreciate the combo. And
do you mind if I just shout out the
yeah, go for it. Yeah,
Instagram account one more time? Yeah, cool. So it's just atlas.news on Instagram. We're hoping to get like a website up soon. So that's about it.
Okay, cool.
Cool, man. It was awesome talking to you. Sorry you didn't get the chroma on Draven in League.
You're fine. Don't worry about it.
See you later, man.
All right.
All the damage you could possibly...
Dude, I don't know. Every time Bloomberg opened his mouth on it, he was just digging deeper and deeper. It was so